At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, a 27-year-old second lieutenant named John George crouched in the broken ribs of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The war in the Pacific had a way of swallowing sound, but that morning the jungle hummed faintly, like it was waiting for something. George pressed his cheek to the stock of a rifle his fellow officers had mocked for weeks. Through the small, circular window of a Lyman Alaskan scope, he watched the far end of a banyan tree 240 yards away. His hands were steady. His heartbeat was not. To the men around him, George was the polite lieutenant from Illinois with a mail-order sweetheart. A joke. A novelty. A man who'd left the States with 0 confirmed kills while the Japanese snipers around Point Cruz had dropped 14 men in 3 days. But to George, this rifle wasn't a toy. It was a promise he'd made to himself long before Guadalcanal. Long before the deadliest snipers in the Pacific learned his name. The rifle no one believed. In 6 weeks earlier, when the Winchester Model 70 finally arrived in a wooden crate marked "Fragile," the supply sergeant laughed before he even opened it. "A deer gun," someone muttered. "A sporting toy," another officer said. Captain Morris, George's commanding officer, didn't even mask the disdain. "You're going to fight the Japanese with that thing?" George didn't bother explaining. Not this time. He already had back in Tennessee when the armorer asked if the rifle was meant for deer or Germans. "Neither," George had answered. "It's for the Japanese." They all laughed the way men laugh when they don't understand something and don't care to. The Winchester Model 70 weighed just over 9 pounds. With the scope and mounts, it hit 11. It held 5 rounds. The standard issue Garand held 8 and fired semi-automatically. George's rifle required him to work the bolt after every shot. To the Army, his rifle was old-fashioned. To George, it was a scalpel. He'd saved 2 years of National Guard pay just to buy it. But fate had played a small joke on him, too. The rifle didn't arrive before he shipped out. While George sailed toward the Pacific, other men cleaned their Garands on deck. George watched them and said nothing. His own rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois, waiting for military mail to catch up somewhere across the ocean. It reached him 6 weeks late, but it reached him. And by then, the Marines had passed him a battlefield that chewed up men by the dozens. The jungle that ate men alive. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the battered Marines of Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had held Henderson Field since August, but that wasn't the whole story. They hadn't cleared the coast. They hadn't rooted out the snipers who moved like ghosts through the banyans. Mount Austin had taken the Marines 16 days of blood to climb. The battalion George belonged to, Illinois farm boys, machinists, carpenters, lost 34 dead and 279 wounded before they finally held a piece of it. George fought with them. He fired his Winchester 0 times. Against bunkers and night assaults, a bolt-action rifle was dead weight. But in the coconut groves and banyan forests around Point Cruz, it was about to become the most important weapon on the island. The Japanese snipers there were different from other soldiers. Patient, invisible, unbelievably precise. They operated from trees as tall as 80-90 feet, suspended among branches thick as walls. No fixed positions, no tracks. Just a faint glint of metal or a quiet breath you'd never hear. In 3 days, they killed 14 Americans. A corporal fetching water, 2 men on patrol. A sergeant shot through the throat from a tree his platoon had passed twice. And that's when George's battalion commander finally called him in. The commander didn't want fancy marksmanship records. He wanted bodies to stop hitting the ground. "Lieutenant," he asked, "can that mail-order rifle of yours actually shoot?" The night before, everything changed. George didn't boast. He simply explained. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards. Winner at age 23, the youngest in state history, 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 shots inside 4 inches at 300 yards with his Lyman Alaskan. His commander listened, nodded once, and pointed toward the jungle. "Dawn, bring the rifle. If you hit what you say you can hit, we'll see." George didn't sleep that night. He disassembled and reassembled his rifle in the dim glow of lantern light. Cleaned off cosmoline that had survived the Pacific voyage. Checked every screw and mount. Laid out 60 rounds. Enough for a long day of hunting. His battalion was bleeding. 14 men dead. Nobody knew where the shots came from. The Japanese were killing them faster than malaria. If his rifle couldn't help, nobody could. Dawn, January 22nd, 1943. The rain had washed the grove clean overnight. A thin mist clung to the trees like a veil. George crawled into the broken bunker they'd taken 3 days earlier and settled into position alone, no spotter. No radio man. Just the rifle, a canteen, and the faint sound of Marines shifting equipment in the distance. The scope's 2.5x magnification wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to catch movements the naked eye dismissed. He scanned each tree left to right, top to bottom, the way years of competition had trained him. And at 9:17 a.m., a branch on a banyan 240 yards away twitched, just once. There was no wind. George watched the spot, breath held. Another twitch. Then he saw the shape, a human silhouette tucked into the fork of 3 massive branches, the sniper facing east, waiting for a chance to kill an American hauling supplies. George made a 2-click wind adjustment, exhaled, touched the trigger, a glass-smooth 3.2 pounds. The Winchester recoiled gently. The crack echoed across the jungle. The sniper's body fell 90 feet, hitting the ground with a sound George could not hear but imagined clearly. The second shot, snipers didn't work alone. The partner, spotter, or alternate had to be close. George scanned tree after tree. At 9:43, he found him. Another sniper moving down a trunk, retreating, knowing his position had been compromised. George tracked him, led the motion, and fired. The second body fell through branches. 2 shots, 2 kills. The jungle swallowed the sound, and suddenly the mail-order sweetheart wasn't funny anymore. By noon, George had killed 5. Men who'd mocked the rifle now came asking if they could watch him at work. He refused. Spectators meant attention, and attention in a sniper duel meant death. The Japanese adept snipers who survive battles learn fast. After George's 5th kill, the Japanese stopped moving during daylight. They froze in position high in trees, waiting for him to blink. He didn't blink. At 4 p.m., he returned to Battalion HQ. Captain Morris didn't bother with sarcasm. He simply said, "Be here again at dawn." January 23rd. The rain test. Tropical rain made the world disappear. George waited in the bunker until visibility returned. The Japanese used the rain too. One sniper climbed during the downpour and took a position nearly 300 yards away. George adjusted for range and dropped him. 6 kills. But the Japanese finally responded. At 9:57, mortars began bracketing his bunker. First salvo, 40 yards short. Second, 20. He didn't wait for the third. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted, diving into a shell crater as the bunker exploded behind him. They were hunting him now. George moved to a fallen tree and resumed looking for shapes. By evening, he had 8 dead snipers in 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 clean misses. The final 3, There were 11 snipers total in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. The last 3 wouldn't make mistakes. They were the best, men who had survived long enough to learn exactly how George shot, how he moved, where he hid. George cleaned his rifle by lantern light, loaded 5 fresh rounds, and tried to sleep. He failed. At 3 a.m., he gave up. Sat in the dark with a rifle across his lap, listening to rain hammer the jungle. The final day was coming, and the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced, one he couldn't yet see, was watching him already. January 24th, the final day. The rain hammered Guadalcanal like it was trying to wash the whole war off the island. At 5:30 a.m., the sky was still dark. The jungle soaked so completely that even the banyan leaves hung limp with water. George used the rain the way only a patient marksman could. He moved early, not to the bunker, not to yesterday's fallen tree, but to a cluster of rocks south of both. A Marine machine gun squad had used the rocks in December. Now the stones hid George from 3 angles and gave him a rare height advantage. A sniper who survives as long as the Japanese marksman at Point Cruz knows one rule. If the enemy thinks they know where you are, you move. Always, George moved. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but he had just slipped behind their expectations. He settled in among the rocks as dawn bled slowly into the world. At 7:43, the rain lifted into a gray drizzle. Visibility returned, but the jungle still carried the weight of storm water, dripping from vines and branches like 1,000 ticking clocks. George lifted his rifle, steadied his breath, and began to glass the trees. It didn't take long. Sniper number 9, the bait. At 8:17, his scope caught something wrong. A palm tree, only 40 feet high. A sniper hidden low in the fronds, tucked into a natural hide that would be invisible from the ground. But George wasn't on the ground. The angle let him see down into the fronds, see the shape of a head and shoulders. He aimed, breathed, prepared to fire. Then something snagged in his instincts. It was too easy. A sniper who had lived through 10 days of American sweeps would never choose a spot where a man on higher ground could see him. Not unless he was meant to be seen. A trap. George lowered his rifle without firing. Most soldiers would have taken the shot. Most would have died for it. He scanned every tree within 300 yards, slowly, deliberately, top to bottom, left to right. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 90 feet up, 80 yards northwest of the palm. Perfect concealment. Branches wrapped like armor. A sniper whose rifle aimed directly at George's old position. The fallen tree destroyed yesterday by machine gun fire. The Japanese had built a kill box designed around George's habits, but George had changed the rules. Using the bait against them, he made his decision. Shoot the decoy first, force the real sniper to move, catch the movement, fire again. 2 shots before they understood what happened. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree and fired. The Japanese sniper jerked and fell out of the fronds, hitting the mud below with a heavy thud. George didn't watch him land. He swung instantly toward the banyan. There. Movement. An instinctive flinch toward the sound of the shot. George fired before the sniper could turn fully. Second shot. Second kill. He had just dismantled a 2-man ambush built specifically to kill him. But he'd also exposed his position. The machine gun's answer. At 8:34, Japanese machine guns tore into the rock cluster George had vacated 6 seconds earlier. Dust and stone fragments exploded upward. Bullets chewed the rocks into teeth. George lay flat in a drainage ditch 40 yards to the east, water filling the ditch up to his chest. He counted 60 seconds. Silence returned. Not peace, just the quiet of men deciding their next move. The 11th sniper. The ghost on the ground. George crawled to a new position, a shell crater partly filled with rainwater. Filthy, cold, but with a thin rim high enough for a rifle rest. He hid with only his eyes above the muddy surface. 10 Japanese snipers were dead. The 11th, the last, was out there. And he wasn't in the trees. George saw it at 9:47, movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. Low, crawling, using vines, ferns, fallen branches. A shape sliding across the ground like a shadow. The sniper wasn't searching for targets. He was hunting George. He was following the path George had taken yesterday when he fled machine gun fire. He was tracking him. This man wasn't just experienced, he was smart. A true predator. George held still in the water. Raising his rifle would expose him. Waiting might get him killed. He chose patience. The last sniper moved to the rocks, looked east toward the drainage ditch, exactly where George should have been. George watched, breath shallow. Then he saw the truth. This sniper wasn't alone. 2 men. A final trap behind a fallen tree 70 yards northwest of the rocks. Another Japanese soldier lay motionless, rifle aimed at the drainage ditch. A 2-man sweep, 1 bait, 1 killer. If George shot one, the other would shoot him. He needed both to move. The water and the waiting. George lowered himself deeper into the crater, submerging until muddy water lapped at his neck. He kept the Winchester pointed up so the barrel wouldn't flood. He waited. He waited through the insects, buzzing around his ears. Waited through the drip of water from leaves. Waited while the 2 Japanese soldiers whispered signals. At 10:13, the soldier at the rocks stood up. They had waited 10 minutes and seen nothing. They thought George had fled farther east. Both men began moving, parallel, sweeping the jungle floor, and every step brought their backs closer to George. When the moment came, George rose from the water like a ghost. He fired. The first soldier dropped, bolt worked, chambered. Second man turning. George fired again. Both soldiers collapsed into the mud. The last snipers were dead. 11 kills in 4 days, all confirmed. But the fight wasn't over. The infantry arrives, leaves rustled, branches snapped, voices, 6 at least, moving toward the bodies. Japanese infantry, a retrieval team. They found the first dead sniper, stopped, talked. They found the second body. More voices, urgent. Confusion and anger layered together. They found the tracks. George had been careful about visibility, careful about sound. But in the mud, his boots had left a trail. The voices moved closer. 20 yards, 15, 10. A helmet appeared at the crater rim. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The man fell backward. 2 more appeared. George fired twice, working the bolt underwater, a movement no textbook would ever teach. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted around him. More soldiers approaching from the south, more from the east. They were flanking him. The escape and the last rounds, George climbed out of the crater's north side, sprinted 20 yards, and dropped behind a dead tree blown apart by artillery months earlier. Bullets whipped the air around him. He stayed low. Glassed the area. Saw 2 more soldiers closing in. He fired. 1 dropped. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left. Voices behind him, Japanese closing in from multiple angles. George didn't hesitate. He broke contact. He sprinted north, weaving through vines and bamboo, legs burning, lungs screaming. Rifle fire followed him. But the jungle played tricks with sound. After 90 seconds of dead sprint, he dove into another shell crater. This one dry, this one safe for a moment. The voices faded. The patrol had stopped to regroup around their dead. At 10:47, George started walking again, using terrain to break lines of sight, listening for anything human. At 11:13, he stumbled into the American perimeter. A Marine sentry raised a rifle. George lifted a hand. "It's Lieutenant George, 132nd." They lowered the weapon. George walked into battalion headquarters covered in mud, water dripping from his uniform, rifle clutched in both hands. Captain Morris stared at him like he was seeing something unreal. "How many?" he asked. George answered simply, 11. Morris nodded once. No jokes, no mockery. The battalion had been saved by a rifle they had once laughed at. The debrief and the beginning of something new. Later that afternoon, Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, sent for him. He wanted details. Shots fired, distances, positions, tactics. George gave everything he had. When he finished, Ferry asked, "Lieutenant, can you train other men to do what you just did?" George nodded. Ferry explained that the unit had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, sniper rifles the Marines had left behind. Ferry had 40 expert marksmen in the regiment. He wanted a sniper section. He wanted George leading it. George accepted, with one condition: "I keep my Winchester." Ferry didn't hesitate. Done. And just like that, the rifle no one had believed in became the foundation of the first organized sniper section the regiment had ever fielded. Training began 4 days later. But what George didn't know, not yet, was that his next war would make Guadalcanal look almost civilized. He was heading towards something darker, something deeper in the jungle, something called Burma. The making of a sniper school. On the morning of January 27th, 1943, the sound of rifles echoed across a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. 40 men stood in the uneven clearing, boots in red mud, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were expert marksmen on paper, men who had fired tight groups at 500 yards back in the States. But none had fired a scoped rifle in combat, and none had watched 11 snipers die in 4 days. Now they stood in front of the man who had done exactly that. A quiet lieutenant from Illinois with a rifle everyone had mocked until it started dropping bodies from trees. George began without ceremony. He didn't talk about bravery. He didn't talk about heroism. He talked about fundamentals. Breathing until your heartbeat slows. Trigger squeeze until the shot breaks by surprise. Wind that lies to you if you don't respect it. Support positions when the jungle gives you nothing but mud and roots. The Springfield rifles with unertl scopes weighed 11 pounds and were long, ungainly tools, nothing like George's elegant Winchester. The unertl optics were heavy, fragile, and required perfect alignment. One careless bump and you were firing blind. George knew it, so he taught them stability. He taught them patience. He taught them how to build firing platforms out of jungle debris. Logs, roots, rocks, sandbags. Anything that kept a rifle steady. By the 3rd day, the men were hitting moving targets at 200 yards. By the 4th, they were putting rounds through palm fronds and thin bamboo without ricochets. By the 6th day, George divided them into 16 two-man teams, each pair consisting of a shooter and a spotter, carrying a Garand and binoculars. A true sniper team doesn't operate with one hero and one assistant. They operate with 2 brains, 2 sets of eyes, and one shared will to cut the enemy apart. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but George had just created the first dedicated sniper section of the Pacific Campaign. The first missions. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission: clear Japanese stragglers west of the Guadalcanal River, infantrymen who had stayed behind to delay American patrols. Not snipers, but seasoned soldiers. Dangerous. George paired himself with Corporal Hayes, a sharp-eyed farm boy from Iowa whose steady hands made him a perfect spotter. At 7:20 a.m., the first Japanese soldier stepped into view on a narrow trail. Hayes whispered, "Target confirmed." George fired once. The man dropped. 7 more Japanese appeared throughout the next 6 hours. George fired 7 times, 6 kills. 1 clean miss, wind. The other teams did nearly as well. By dusk, they counted 23 confirmed kills, not 1 American casualty. The sniper section had proven its worth. The 12-day campaign. Through early February, the sniper section became a scalpel slicing through the jungle. They operated quietly, methodically, without fanfare. They killed 74 Japanese soldiers in 12 days. Confirmed bodies, not estimates. 74 men, 0 friendly casualties. The Japanese withdrew from Guadalcanal entirely by February 9th. They fled by night across dangerous waters, abandoning positions they had held for months. George had helped force that retreat. But the war wasn't done with him. The wound that changed everything. On February 7th, during a sweep near the Tanamba River, George spotted movement at 300 yards. He shouldered the Winchester. The shot never came. A Japanese bullet slammed into his left shoulder, spinning him off his feet. He didn't remember falling. He only remembered the sound, like someone had punched him with a hammer. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was bad, but not fatal. The bullet passed through muscle, missing bone and arteries. George was evacuated back to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound, stitched it, and ordered 3 weeks of rest. He lay in a cot under a canvas roof while rain thudded overhead. Guadalcanal was being declared secure. The island that had nearly killed him was being abandoned to a new phase of war. But George felt restless. His work on Guadalcanal was done. Something else was coming. Orders for Burma. During his recovery, new orders arrived. The army needed experienced jungle fighters, men who could operate deep behind Japanese lines, without supply routes, without help, without rest. George volunteered without hesitation. By March 1943, he boarded a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester rode with him, sealed in a waterproof case. The Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth, the stock cleaned until it gleamed. He didn't know where he was going, only that the next fight would be darker. The ship reached India on April 3rd. There, the Army revealed the mission. George was to join a new American unit formed for one purpose: penetrate the Burmese jungle and carve a path the Japanese believed was impossible. A unit without a formal name yet. A unit that would become legendary under a different one. Merrill's Marauders. Merrill's Marauders, the March of Death. The Marauders, officially the 5307th Composite Unit, were modeled after the British Chindits, guerrilla forces built for deep, endurance-based operations far behind Japanese lines. Their mission: cut through northern Burma, destroy supply depots, ambush convoys, and eventually seize the Myitkyina airfield, a strategic jewel the Japanese guarded fiercely. They carried everything on their backs: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, mortars, no trucks, no jeeps, no artillery, no reinforcements, just men, pack mules, rifles, and the will to outlast the jungle. George was assigned as a rifle platoon leader, though headquarters knew well what he could do with a scoped rifle. The march begins. The Marauders entered the Burmese jungle in February 1944. The first week alone covered 83 miles through terrain so brutal that experienced soldiers puked from exhaustion. Men collapsed. Mules broke legs and were shot on the spot. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds that darkened the air. Leeches slid along your skin without you feeling them until you saw blood. Water rotted boots and infected cuts. George watched men with flawless marksmanship crumble under disease and starvation. But he also saw how a single rifle, well placed, could save dozens of lives. The long-range shots, the Burmese jungle rarely allowed long-range shooting. Visibility was often 30 feet or less. Most firefights were ambushes, violent, close, and over in seconds. Yet 3 times in those months, the jungle opened just enough for George to use his Winchester the way it was designed to be used. Once at 412 yards, a Japanese officer directing troops across a river crossing. George dropped him with a single shot. Once at 380 yards, a machine gun position pinning down a marauder column. The gun fell silent after George's bullet struck. Once at 290 yards, a Japanese sniper who had killed 2 marauders in minutes. George shot him out of a tree with cold precision. 3 shots, 3 kills, each one changing the outcome of the day. But long shots were rare. Most of Burma swallowed distance like an ocean. The cost of the jungle. The march lasted 3 months. The marauders moved more than 700 miles, often living on half rations of rice, crawling with insects. Malaria struck nearly everyone. Dysentery forced men to drop weight until their uniforms hung like curtains on skeletons. Typhus, trench foot, heat stroke. Every day was a list of ways to die without seeing the enemy. By late May, out of the original 5,300 men, fewer than 3,000 remained combat capable. George kept moving. He fired the Winchester only rarely now. The jungle prevented most clear shots, but he never left the rifle behind. It remained strapped across his back like a part of his spine. The battle for Myitkyina, on May 17, 1944. After months of starvation, ambushes, and disease, the marauders reached their target. They captured the Myitkyina airfield, the only all-weather strip in northern Burma, a prize the Japanese had guarded like a jewel. The cost was devastating. The unit was combat ineffective. Men collapsed even after the battle ended. Many couldn't stand without help. George survived. Barely. But his rifle had fired fewer than a dozen times in Burma. This wasn't Guadalcanal. There were no trees with snipers at 300 yards. This was a knife-fight war in a jungle that hated everyone equally. The war ends for George. By June 1944, George and the remnants of the marauders were evacuated. The unit disbanded. The survivors were given medical leave or reassigned. George was sent back to the United States. He didn't carry his Winchester into combat again, but he carried its lessons. The teacher at Fort Benning, he became an instructor for infantry officers. He taught small unit tactics, marksmanship, and the principles of jungle warfare. He taught them what he had learned in the groves of Point Cruz. How to read movement in a world of shadows. How to shoot at distances most soldiers couldn't imagine. How to stay alive when the enemy was patient. How to recognize traps built around your own habits. Dozens of officers learned from him. Many would take those lessons to Korea and Vietnam. The man who wrote the truth. George left the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, a combat infantry badge. He went to Princeton on the GI Bill, graduated with highest honors, studied politics at Oxford, traveled across Africa studying institutions and governments. He rarely spoke of Guadalcanal or Burma or the Winchester. But he wrote it down, every lesson, every detail, every shot, not as a memoir, but as a manual for future soldiers. Those pages became Shots Fired in Anger, published in 1947, still used today by historians and marksmen alike. One of the most precise, clear-eyed descriptions of small arms combat ever written. The rifle that outlasted them all, John George lived to see the Garand replaced by the M14. Then the M16. Then the next generation of rifles. He lived through Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. Wars fought by soldiers who had no idea that a quiet lieutenant once changed the Army's entire understanding of marksmanship. He died on January 3rd, 2009, at 90 years old. And the Winchester Model 70 that had killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days? It rests today behind glass at the National Firearms Museum in Virginia. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. To them, it looks like any old hunting rifle. Plain, unremarkable, unworthy of attention. But to those who know, those who have read the history, those who understand what a single determined soldier can do, it is a relic of the moment one man proved something eternal. Skill still matters. Patience still matters. A good rifle in the right hands can change the outcome of a war. And on Guadalcanal, in the groves west of Point Cruz, one man with a mail-order rifle did exactly that.